The following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
Good afternoon. You can find a seat. We'll get started with the program. Welcome back. I'm delighted to have the opportunity this afternoon to introduce our two distinguished speakers, Professor Paul Krugman and Professor Janet Gornick. We're extremely fortunate at CUNY to have such powerful voices in the examination of the issues of inequality, and we have this opportunity today to hear from them. But just as important is the background of this conference, which I think we will look back on as a landmark in our understanding of some of the ways inequality is manifested in New York City. The Equality Indicators Database, a long-range project at the Institute for State and Local Governance, is a new tool that has the potential for illuminating this subject in new and important ways. Its early findings already have, but there will be much more. It's likely to influence our research, and we hope some opinions and policies. There is, of course, no shortage of opinions on inequality and what, if anything, should be done to address them. But one of the clearest lessons for those who participate in these important debates, and especially for those who write about them, is that the easy part is expressing an opinion. That's especially evident as we head into the battle zone known as the election cycle. Candidates and commentators are expected to tick off firmly held views on everything from the war in Syria to domestic marriage to inequality at a moment's notice. But for those who live and breathe public policy, those with a responsibility for truly understanding these issues and formulating solutions, glib is not good. The hard work comes in trying to thoughtfully identify the real challenges, define them with care, and apply the resources of the social sciences to deliver fresh ideas for producing better outcomes. We've entered into the era of big data, for better or for worse, but the better is that it's given us a powerful new means for doing our work. It has not relieved us, however, of the often painstaking work with the evidence that is required if we're really going to inform thoughtful policy and see differences. That's why I believe this conference represents the opening of an important new chapter in CUNY's decades of success in analyzing critical problems in the city and contributing to the development of fresh policy perspectives. As a public university system, we have a special obligation to provide the intellectual leadership. With this gathering, the Institute is releasing its early findings from the Equality Indicators Database. Already at this early stage, it's like getting a new pair of glasses. We're seeing better than ever before who we are and the ways in which some of us in this city are reaching our aspirations and some are not. And this is just the start. There are few people who appreciate that kind of hard work that's required better than Professor Paul Krugman. Professor Krugman holds two positions. At CUNY, he's a distinguished professor of economics at the Graduate Center and is also a distinguished scholar at the Luxembourg Income Studies Center, which is an influential locus for the study of inequality internationally. The remarkable collection of awards he has earned, including, of course, the Nobel Prize in Economics and a Pulitzer for his columns in the New York Times, speaks to his reach and influence. What I find compelling in his writing in this time of political polarization and instant opinions is that whether or not you agree with him, he has a persistent habit of relying on facts. Everything seems to matter to Professor Krugman. He addresses contentious issues like taxes and budget deficits, monetary policy and economic growth, and of course, economic inequality. But before he delivers his conclusions, Professor Krugman usually describes with some care what he believes to be the historical data and its correlations and what they support or do not support. At times he writes of the weaknesses in and the ambiguity of the data, which can also be quite helpful. Critics can and do dispute him, naturally. They can marshal their own data and interpret it differently. We all benefit from that kind of smart debate. When these conversations are well informed, it can help push them towards something we prize here, a refinement of facts so that they can help lead to effective problem solving. That's a field that few understand better than our moderator in today's conversation with Professor Krugman, Janet Gornick, Professor of Political Science and Sociology and Director of the Luxembourg Income Studies Center at the CUNY's Graduate Center. Professor Gornick has for years written thoughtfully on measures of inequality and helped build and broaden the Luxembourg program. It provides broad perspectives on income inequality measurements in about 50 countries and gives researchers an ability to do a deep dive into the data at a micro level as a remarkable resource. We all benefit from this mission, and we cherish it at the Graduate Center. Professor Krugman, Professor Gornick, we look forward to your discussion today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Krugman and Professor Gornick.
Thank you. Thank you to the Chancellor. I'm going to begin by thanking Paul Krugman for coming, given that he is stoned on antibiotics and sick with something that is affecting his hearing. So I was trying to figure out how to gracefully organize a conversation with someone who can't really hear. So I'm going to shout, and we'll hope that he can hear. But
Say something? No, it's actually, yeah, it's a little weird. But anyway,
nearly crawled, literally has come out of his sickbed to come be with us. So we're grateful for that. Let me begin with a rather general question, and you'll bear with me, I hope, for the audience, as I just set this up in a couple of sentences. So in the world that I've worked in for so many years, the Luxembourg Income Study, at which Paul is very familiar with, and many of our colleagues at the OECD and other statistical offices, the IMF, we usually think about inequality within national borders. Our colleague Branko Milanovic, who's here at the Graduate Center and at LIS, but out of town today, has spent years carrying out parallel research, but his geographic boundary is the globe. Very innovative and important work. So the choice of geographic boundary matters, of course. Obviously, Paul, as you know, it makes a difference empirically. Something we've learned from Branko is that inequality within countries is moving in a different direction than inequality at the global level. And it also matters normatively because it starts to push us as we choose the geographic boundary to the question of who is our community? To whom are we comparing people when we think of well-being? Is it the national community? Is it the human community? So this work today and the conference is shifting our gaze in a way that many of us, myself for sure, rarely think this way, shifting us to think about the city. And this city, in particular New York City. So Paul, my question to you is, of course, you've thought a lot about inequality, and I want you to begin by reflecting on the value and the consequences of considering inequality in this local context. As we scope down to the city level, does it make you think about inequality differently?
Not sure. I think what happens, all of the geographic domains are worth looking at. They're all relevant, but you want to look at them to answer different questions. So the global story is one if you are thinking in terms of some kind of cosmopolitan welfare criterion, if you have a kind of Rawlsian view of humanity, and if I were a random human being, who would I be? The global thing is terribly important, and I found the Branko Milanovic chart, the one that shows growth in income in the world as a whole, as having two peaks. There's a global 1% that's done very well, but there's also a emerging markets middle class that's done very well, and that changes your view of how you think about globalization and what it's meant. At the national level, it seems relevant to view differences, particularly amongst otherwise similar countries within the OECD, to think of inequality as reflecting something about policies and institutions. If you want to ask why does Germany have a substantially lower level of inequality than the U.S., you want to talk about things like the tax and transfer system. You want to talk about the bargaining power of labor and so on. Now, if we bring it down to the city level, you have stark differences in inequality among cities, which are telling you, now, often you'll want to be saying that this is not really reflecting policies or institutions, it's simply reflecting the fact that they're part of an integrated national economy and playing different roles. So I did a quick search, right? You look at, there are some Gini coefficients by metro area. New York is not surprisingly near the top. Albany turns out to be near the bottom. So Albany is a very egalitarian city by that measure. New York City very inegalitarian. Is that telling us that Albany has a more effective social safety net than New York City? Is it telling us that they has empowered? No, it's telling us that they're different kinds of cities doing very different things. And New York, in particular, as one of the world's two great financial hubs, has a lot of the world's financial elite here, which pushes the right tail of the distribution way out there. it's still important to know about that. In some ways, if you think about inequality as mattering because it's the shape of the society in which people live, the fact of the matter is that a resident of New York is going to be living in this society. Whatever the cause of it, we are a society that has a very fat right tail because of the role of New York. And also it says something about the resources that are available to at least mitigate some of the great inequalities. So I think it is useful. And it's quite different. I mean, at the national level, there's a little bit of that, right? Part of the reason the 1% is bigger in Britain than it is in continental Europe is the City of London. But still, it's a useful perspective, and after all, here we are, and the question is, what can you do?
So we are going to talk specifically, as you know, in a little bit about policy, but I guess the other question that people often ask is, does it make sense to think about inequality at the city level when in most cases that's not where the policy levers are located?
Well, yeah, easy enough for me to say. Sorry. Some of the policy levers are local, or at least could be local. Right? There are things that require national action. There are things, however, that might be important that could be done at a more local level. Sometimes, and then there are questions about whether you're allowed to. So there's a question about will Albany let things be done that even that they're only actually New York metro policies. And I think that's important. If nothing can be, if you had an idealized world in which wise men and women got together and formulated policy at all levels of government, then maybe we would say, well, let's only talk about where the most effectual policy interventions are. But in fact, we have a political system, there are divisions, there are disagreements. If a majority in Congress does not share the values or objectives of a majority in New York City, then even though there may be limits on what can be done at a local level, still you want to do what can be done at that level. So I think it is relevant. And a little bit of history. If you think about the New Deal, which many of us, I'm in the group that thinks that was one of the truly great things that happened to America, it didn't come out of nowhere. It actually bubbled up at a state and local level first. Many of the policies that eventually became national were pioneered, actually many of them here. And so you do want to look at that as a relevant thing. Sure, I mean, if you want America to turn into Scandinavia or something like that, then that can't be done at the level of an individual city, even this city. But if you want to make America a little bit less unequal, or if you want to make New York a little bit less unequal, there are certainly ways you can do that.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to a second question that I want to ask, which of course is very much rooted in the conference and the indicators and why we're here today. So as I just did a moment ago, I sort of want to say the same again, which is that the way that many of us who study income inequality, there is a way in which many of us have been studying inequality, and this approach is very different, which I think is really quite interesting and challenging. So a lot of us in the world that I've been involved in, and Paul and others, and the world of Thomas Piketty and others, we generally, when we talk about inequality, economic inequality, most of us focus on earnings, household income, and wealth, and we generally talk about the distribution, the famous Gini coefficient, the share of the resources held by the bottom 10 or the top 10 or the top 1 or something. When I opened this report, and I've seen some of it in development, there are two things that I noted. First of all, is that it's much broader and much more multidimensional. So the economy section, which we're focusing on obviously, includes not just income, but also employment, the prevalence of retirement, connection to business, and so forth, and even job placement among former recipients of public assistance. So it's much more multidimensional. And the second thing is, of course, it takes, I think everybody who's been here today has seen this already, this perspective of constructing inequality as ratios between groups.
Right.
So the framework of intergroup disparity, choosing in particular, as you know, two groups that have demonstrably different levels of hardship or well-being. So what are your thoughts about taking this approach to studying inequality levels and trends, either in general or in relation to New York City?
Okay, I think there's certainly, it's an approach, and I think you do learn something. We even all of us, do look, when we're looking at national trends, even if you're trying to look at things like the Gini coefficient or the share of the 1% or whatever, we're also interested in what's happening to whites versus non-whites, or we're interested in what's happening by education level. And so this is a valid, useful set of comparisons to make, as long as you understand that it's not the whole story. And when I talk about trends in income inequality in the United States more generally, I tend to, I think I coined this, it is fractal. That is, you look at any subgroup and you see the same thing happening that you see at the broader level. So that if while it's true that you see college-educated over the longer term, not so much in the past 15 years, but over the longer term, college-educated Americans have done better than non-college-educated Americans. There's also been a big increase in inequality within college-educated Americans. And then within, and that's partly because different professions have diverged, but then within professions, you can go down and down and down. Eventually, you find out that there's been a huge increase in inequality of income among dentists, right? It's that kind of something. So, and which means that any kind of aggregating that doesn't, in the end, talk about the distribution among individuals is missing an important part of the story. And I feel that that gap is bigger for New York City even than it is nationally because of what we were just talking about. New York City is it is the financial capital of the country. It is the rentier capital. It's where wealthy people from all over the world come to establish residence. And so there is a huge right tail of people who are part of some of these aggregates but are not representative at all of what the other people in those aggregates are. So college-educated. College-educated includes school teachers, and it includes private equity guys. Whites includes, by and large, to be honest, private equity guys, and a lot of people who are, mostly people who are not. And so I'm a little concerned, at any rate, that this is a very partial. It's interesting, and it's easier, I think, to get these many dimensions, so to get beyond just money. But it is it's missing a lot of what we think we should be talking about, above all in this city at this time.
If I could just add to that, I said this myself in the last panel as well, that one of my concerns, I think the good news of this approach is it sort of opened the curtain on these intergroup differences, which has been lost. But it also, to me, it seems a little bit as if class gets lost because we lose the distance, from the top to the bottom and so forth.
That's right. That's right. If a working class, it would be a question. There's a working class white family and a working class non-white family. How different are they in how they're faring in this city right now? I don't actually know the answer to that. The trouble is, if you just compare whites and non-whites, that's not going to answer that question because the whites are going to be, the average is going to be dragged up by the disproportionate membership of whites in this. However, in this quite small overclass, if you like. So, I understand from a data point of view, and not just data, a human point of view. There are many things that we have no way, I think, at this point of doing anything like a Gini coefficient for things like access to parks. So we don't really have, you're able to take a much wider view of the things that matter, but at the cost of losing the class element within these subgroups.
Well, thank you. I think we'll come back to this a little bit as we talk about some particular, I'm going to ask Paul to talk about some particular policy initiatives in just a few minutes. So let me step back again then and ask the question that is always asked, but it has to be, which is why do we care about inequality? So I know everyone in this room has been thinking about this. Sometimes we simply talk about concerns about justice, that the levels and trends in inequality in New York and in the U.S. are just not acceptable in a fair and decent society. But I think it's clear also in recent years, in the last 5 years, that much of the discussion about inequality has been instrumental in nature. Inequality is problematic because it causes other things that we all agree are problematic. So I noted at least 3 of them, all of which I know you've thought about a lot. Is inequality harmful for growth? Is it harmful for mobility, intergenerational mobility? And does it damage the democratic process? So say a little bit about growth. It's a question that was asked earlier, and I think you've, obviously we know you've thought about that a lot.
For those who don't know, of course, Janet and I are part of there are many, many meetings on all this. There was a quite big Inequality and Growth conference at Columbia recently, and with a number of papers arguing that inequality hurts growth, and a little bit of skepticism, and I gave a cautionary talk. But the theme was "Don't be greedy." I think that the work on inequality and growth is interesting, but a little problematic. Partly because I know from Janet that to know which data are really solid and the data that they were using are not quite up to list standards, if I might say, but also that you have to do quite a lot of stretching and pulling and massaging to extract what looks like the result. And in general, the whole business of cross-country regressions, too much. But it is. I find just a dubious. I mean, not dubious, but not an enterprise in which I have a whole lot of faith. I think cause and effect are really hard to disentangle. What's really clear is that you don't see anything that says that higher inequality is good for growth, and that attempts to reduce inequality hurt growth. There's no hint of that. And if you think that inequality is a bad thing, which you should, if only, I mean, among other things, because it means that reduce inequality and the median income rises, even if the mean income does not, but also the other things we're going to talk about in a minute, then you should be, the usual argument against that is, but if you try to do anything about it, you'll kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, and it'll be a job killer and a growth killer, and what about entrepreneurs and all that? And the fact that there's no evidence at all that that's something to worry about, given the levels of inequality mitigation that we see in today's world, is really all you need. And if you don't want to stake your case on what I think is still a fairly flaky, not necessarily wrong, but it's just not solidly grounded notion that inequality is bad for growth.
And we know also, as I know you know, just to add to that, it really depends on what kind of inequality. Inequality at the bottom, inequality at the top, inequality of what. I think it's fair to say that Paul broke a number of hearts by not making that argument strongly in a room full of people who wanted to hear it.
There's a general principle I like to have, that if there's something you would really like to be true, you want to bend over backwards not to accept it. So breaking hard.
Indeed.
If you care about inequality, you want to believe that inequality is great for everything.
There were a lot of dejected faces when he said it's really not a very good argument. So why do we care then? Okay. You're not so worried about growth. Why do we care?
So first of all, there is if there's a pie of a given size, if a large slice of that pie goes to a handful of people, that means that the typical person has less, and that's just the simplest thing. Everybody in modern America claims to be for equality of opportunity. But if you say, I don't care about inequality of outcomes, I only care about equality of opportunity, you're kidding yourself. Because the fact of the matter is a highly unequal society is inherently one in which opportunity is also highly unequal. That's very much true of America today. Enormous disparities in educational and career outcomes coming from differences in the socioeconomic status of one's parents. Rich, dumb kids are more likely to graduate college than smart, poor kids. And it's so a highly unequal society at a point in time is also going to be a society in which there's nothing like an equal chance at the starting line. And if that's a value that nobody in this country will at least admit to not sharing, and quite a few people probably privately have aristocratic inclinations, but it's not something any politician will admit to being against. And so, but that requires at least a moderately equal society, and the society in which we had a lot of upward mobility for most people who are now in some position of influence and think, well, I was born into a working family and I did great. that was a different society from the one we have right now. And so that's actually, someone of your class coming up through today's society actually has much less of a chance than you did. And that's important to understand. Democratic process. Of course. The money does talk, and it talks much more loudly when the money is very unevenly distributed. And that clearly subverts the process. I was just looking at there's real work here. I mean, there's political science work by Larry Bartels and colleagues that look at the preferences of the elite versus preferences of the general public, and it's a remarkable number of issues on which the general public's preferences seem to not count at all, and the preferences of the elite. Or actually, just to take, what's been in the news this week. Just looking at some Gallup polling, I think I can almost reproduce the numbers because they're going to be in tomorrow's column. 61% of the public believes that the rich pay too little in taxes. 13% believe that they pay too much. Among Republicans, self-identified Republicans, by about 2 to 1, people say that the rich pay too little in taxes rather than too much. What do the tax plans, the announced tax plans of all of the candidates, actually do? So you're seeing clearly that somehow or other democracy doesn't seem to matter, and donors do, and that's a pretty impressive demonstration that the democratic process is undermined. Let me add, I think there's a fourth one, which is simply the shape of society, if you like, maybe the dignity, or how people feel about their place in the world. And I know that's kind of touchy-feely, squishy, but I think it's very real. I think that a society in which you know that you are that you're fighting a traffic jam, but a few people are flying over it in helicopters. And that's true both literally and metaphorically in a lot of ways in the society we now have. That does, in fact, undermine people's sense of being, that we're a society in which everybody has equal worth. Don't have to have absolute equality of incomes to have some rough sense of equality of dignity, but you have to have not too great a disparity. And I think that's an important, if hard to quantify, aspect of inequality.
That's right. And how much inequality is too much inequality?
Well, a little bit of a pornography standard, right? You know it when you see it. But the point is that when you do reach a level where it does seem that we are not the kind of society that we like to imagine ourselves as being, then it becomes clear. And I think maybe it's just because of life cycle, but the level of income inequality that we had in the 1960s did not seem to be one that undermined the democratic nature of society. The level of inequality we have now does, and I think that's I don't know what, maybe eventually, maybe some bright researcher will come up and tell us that the Atkinson coefficient of X is the threshold. But I think at this point, it's more of a soft notion.
I love it when economists talk about dignity. It's sort of a different vocabulary. Let me turn our attention to public policy. So everybody in this room knows that there's been this extraordinary explosion of interest in inequality. In the last 5 years, all of us in the field have been following it with amazement and I think gratitude. A discussion has come out in the United States, and we know in the United Kingdom as well from the work of Tony Atkinson and others, is a new discussion about talking about policy in terms of whether it's pre-distributive or redistributive. Redistributive, of course, a term we know well. Pre-distributive referring to essentially reorganizing the earnings distribution in a nutshell, and redistributive referring to reorganizing that distribution through taxes and transfers. What's the relative merits of pre versus redistribution? What makes most sense today, including, say, in New York City, both vis-a-vis policy effectiveness and political feasibility?
Okay, those are the two criteria. Now, the interesting thing is even the policy effectiveness the best that we, as I understand it now, once you start to think seriously about these things, there's a kind of a, if you like, a knee-jerk economist reaction, which is let the market work and then we'll try to fix it later. But once you start to get serious about doing these things, you actually realize that that's probably not right. That even from a pure sort of efficient targeting of policy point of view, you want to be doing both. And the classic there now, it's a relatively recent, but I think it's already achieved classic status. We want to raise wages of low-paid workers. We want to raise the earnings of low-paid workers. We want or their incomes. Should that be through something like a wage subsidy, the earned income tax credit, or should that be through a higher minimum wage? And a lot of economists, I think probably you can find me saying this when I was younger and not sufficiently critical, saying, well, of course, the EITC is a better thing rather than intervening in the market. But it's now been pointed out that the problem with trying to subsidize wages is that it's not very well targeted on what you want to do. If you subsidize wages, a fair bit of that may end up going to the employers rather than to the workers in the form of lower wages rather than higher earnings. So if you have a double-barreled policy that includes a wage subsidy and a minimum wage, you're much more likely to actually have the money doing what it's supposed to do. And I think that's kind of a motivating example for the general point, that you really want to be doing both policies. Then on the political feasibility, it's an interesting thing. The general public tends to be much more approving of pre-distribution than redistribution. Support for minimum wage is extraordinarily high among everybody except the 1%. And that's not irrelevant. If you have a goal, you want to reduce inequality. The perfect policy might involve a relatively high mix towards redistribution, but if pre-distribution is what you can get, you might want to do that.
Perfect segue. Then let me ask you about some specific policies about New York City. Then we'll think about New York City. So I'm going to ask you about three things, all about sort of pre-distribution, meaning all of these affect the earnings distribution. Of course, we can talk for hours about income taxes and transfers, but to some extent we'll lay that aside or perhaps till the questions. In New York, let's talk about the bottom of the earnings distribution. So in New York, there's a movement underway to implement a citywide $15 an hour minimum wage. The governor has proposed a plan such that would be phased in New York City in 2018 and statewide in 2021. So my question, Paul, for you, of course, what do you think? Can this work in New York City? Who would win and who would lose? And then obviously the question that's always hanging over this is, as per the critics will say, that's too high. Employers will hire fewer workers and cut their hours. Can the city tolerate a $15 an hour minimum wage?
So just to not leave you in suspense, yes, for it. A little now for the argument. So this is actually we have a lot of evidence on the effects of minimum wage increases in the past, New York, but everywhere, which is one of the most compelling sets of empirical results I've ever seen in economics, and surprising because coming in, a lot of economists thought basically a priori, well, must reduce employment. But we have overwhelming evidence from many natural experiments where one state raised minimum wages and a neighboring state did not, that the effects on employment of the kinds of minimum wage hikes that we have seen in this country in the past are minimal, that it really is no or very minor employment cost. Now, the trouble with those results is that the range is of minimum wage changes you see is somewhat limited, and I think even everybody agrees that there is some sufficiently high minimum wage where it would start to cause job problems. A $100 an hour minimum wage is not going to work. Then the question is, do we think that $15 brings us anywhere close to that point where the historical benignness of minimum wage hikes is no longer true? Nationally, if you did it nationally, you would worry a little bit about some of the lower productivity regional economies. You can make a reasonable case that a $15 minimum wage might be problematic in Mississippi, let's say, or actually Puerto Rico. It's an interesting question. Okay. Could Puerto Rico handle a $15 an hour minimum wage? And that's I don't actually know the answer to that, but I'm willing to be doubtful. But come back to what New York City is. What we've been talking about, New York City's export sector in the regional science sense, not the international trade sense. The sector that sells to the rest of the world, including the rest of the United States, is a very high value, high productivity, extremely high paid sector, largely finance, few other things. Minimum wage hike is not going to affect the competitiveness of that at all. It's going to be changing the wages of workers who are essentially providing services to the people who are in that export industry. We know quite strongly that there's not much substitution away from labor. I mean, yes, a few fast food outlets will buy more machines and employ fewer workers, but it's just not visible at all in past hikes. So there's absolutely no reason to think that a $15 minimum wage would be a problem for New York. We have a little bit of an ongoing experiment in Seattle right now, and so far all of the bad consequences are not happening. So fine for New York. Nationally, maybe you would worry a little bit. I would probably, if asked yes or no even on a national basis, I'd probably say yes. But for New York City, and even for New York State, it's no problem at all.
And what about the argument that increases productivity among low-wage workers by
there
reducing
is some,
turnover?
as part of the story, one of the questions has been, how can we have this result that says that raising the cost of labor or some kind of labor does not, if anything, it looks like it might have a slight positive effect on employment in these natural experiments. And there are a bunch of explanations, but one of them is, in fact, that there are alternative strategies that firms can follow, that they can follow to caricature a bit, but not too much. There's a Walmart and a Costco strategy. The Walmart strategy of always low wages, always, and 50% turnover in the workforce every year, and low productivity and low morale, but cheap, and a Costco strategy of somewhat higher wages, more benefits, treat your workers better, have more loyalty, better morale, higher productivity. And if you're causing firms to flip into the more positive strategy, then that's going to be beneficial all across the board.
So let's turn our attention to the top of the earnings distribution. A New York City story is, of course, very well known for the prevalence of these super high earners, whose money is coming in the form of a mix of labor and sort of employer-related capital income. But nevertheless, high earnings at the top. Should we tamp down on the top in terms of earnings? I've heard people talk about a maximum wage, the mirror of the minimum wage. It's not usually taken terribly seriously by policymakers. Is that a ridiculous idea? If we do want to bring down the top, we do that through so-called confiscatory taxes, taxes that are so high that one would reduce the pay. We do it by changing the way boards work. Should we do it? How would we do it?
Okay. Here, couple of things. First of all, at the national level, things we could do as a national level. I think just a ceiling on wages is, if you start to think about that, and that really does create some pretty weird incentive effects. Even a card-carrying liberal starts to wonder about that. Things like changing the composition of boards. So we were talking the other day about Germany has, they have much more of their formal structure of corporate boards is much more designed around a philosophy of stakeholder capitalism rather than the U.S. version, where the stockholders are really the only people to whom you are responsible, and some of that can help. Other things, union. When people try to explain the explosion of executive compensation in the U.S. that begins around 1980, a lot of it is about the decline of the outrage constraint. And so who was it who turned outrage over pay into an effective limit on pay? That had to do in part with unions. So if anything you could do that would empower unions would probably have a damping effect on high pay as well as the effect of raising pay of ordinary workers. And then also, and certainly both, the case for redistribution, for higher taxation at the top, is both, it's partly that there's money, there's now a significant amount of money out there, which can be used to pay for good stuff, but also that there's reason to believe that that actually has the effect of limiting extravagant demands. Essentially, if you are a CEO who basically gets to appoint the board that determines how much you should be paid, how far are you willing to exploit that? If you get to keep a smaller fraction of your outrageous pay, you may be more interested in actually maintaining a good relation, good morale within the company and the respect of your workers. So there's actually some evidence, serious evidence, that factor has operated in the past. So it's a mix of stuff. I actually think it's harder actually to devise a policy that will limit top earnings than it is to devise a policy that will raise earnings at the bottom. I think we know quite well what to do at the bottom. At the top, there's a bunch of stuff you can try. And in New York City, with this enormous inequality, largely owing to the fact that it is the financial and rentier capital of the Western world, what you're looking, a lot of the point is simply that there's money up there, and if you can collect even a little bit of it, it can do an enormous amount for people who are really needy in the city.
And what about the middle then? It tends to be sort of the residual group, but we know there are lots of things happening with the middle class, something I've studied quite a bit. If you sort of define it as a part of the income distribution, fix it, it's shrinking.
Right.
Other ways you look at it is getting poorer, most of the movement is downward. And of course, it's not just in income and earnings, it's also in job conditions. And Jacob Hacker's work on the Great Risk Shift, I think, is really a story of almost tragic proportions. What can we do in New York City to think about this so-called sagging middle? And I guess I would come back again, are unions a big part of the story?
Yeah, I think unions is the most obvious thing that you can do. Certainly on the pre-distribution side, unions can, there are a lot of jobs that can be middle class, but don't have to be. And the difference has a lot to do with organization. And in a way, the same considerations that say that you could do a substantially higher minimum wage in New York City would also say that you can have substantially more unionization without really undermining the city's ability to compete.
And how to strengthen union? What do you have
Well, that's an interesting question.
Do that for us.
That's a lot. That, unfortunately, I think the policy levers don't have to be, but in fact are at the national level. So the Employee Free Choice Act, which, alas, along with a lot of other good things, died in 2009. Which the most important thing was card check, which would have basically just streamlined, redressed the de facto imbalance of power between employers and workers in forming unions. That's the kind of thing that could make a large difference. Just, I think, in general, and to an important extent, actually, as even enforcing existing labor law. There's a lot of union suppression that involves violations that have been winked at, and you can change that. Let me also say that social insurance, the guaranteed health insurance is the biggest, actually in many ways, actually the very poorest, at least in a state like New York, we're already probably going to be covered. So it is actually working class families for whom it's a big gain and a big increase in security, even more than whatever the income gain may be, or the implied income gain. It makes a big difference in security, and more of that, public services more generally.
What do you think of this argument? This ties together the question about sort of tamping down the top and securing the middle into sort of a single question. Robert Frank has written a lot with the claim that inequality harms the middle class. I think many of you may know this story, which I find compelling. I've never quite figured out if it's right or not, but it's certainly compelling. The argument being that, of course, flyaway income at the top is causing, among other things, pulling up housing prices, causing people to overconsume, overwork, in addition to as the well-to-do have exited the public grid, put their kids in private schools, working class, middle class people are moving to the suburbs, houses they can't afford, setting off a cascade of consumption and debt. And that would argue that if you could pull down the top, you could secure the middle to some extent?
Yeah. I think, I find the argument persuasive as well, and then the channels are a little bit obscure. So you can see some of it. You can see the housing prices. You can see the impact on public schools, the psychological, the kind of consumption cascades are probably there. Although I have to say, if I were going to make there is a question about whether inequality through that kind of Robert Frank type process was a major driver of the increase in household debt, and that's one of those stories that I would like to believe, and I'm leaning against it, partly because I'd like to believe it, partly because there actually it is helpful to think about international evidence, and when you notice that really high levels of household debt are found in places like Denmark, you start to say, well, I'm not sure that that's the story then, but I think there's at least something to it. But the main reason to tax the wealthy in a place like New York City is not to make them poorer, but just to get some of their money and use it for very badly needed things.
That's a good point. Let me turn your attention while you're still alive there.
Yeah.
We are sitting here today, I say with pride, in one of the campuses of the great city University of New York. There's a lot of discussion in the report here, we are not going to focus on it too much, about the importance of education as an inequality, reducing inequality. That's a discussion that's been around for many decades. I was very happy to see in the report this disaggregation into early education, elementary and middle, high school, and higher education, because I think, of course, they all operate differently. But let's think about higher education. People love to say that we can educate our way out of the inequality problems in the United States. I'd like to hear you comment on that. But what's the role of public higher education in particular? What could CUNY, with adequate resources, expect to accomplish? And I just have to add an absolutely random fact. It's not a random fact, but something I learned today. I pulled out my camera and took a picture on the subway on my way here, and it said 8 out of 10 CUNY students graduate without debt. I did not know that. Did anybody here know that?
Me.
I did?
I was going to refer to the same
Oh, maybe it just appeared yesterday.
Coming here.
I literally did not know that, and I should. So there's a debt story we know from Elizabeth Warren, Debt Matters. So CUNY, what is the role of a big public education in this inequality story?
Well, I mean, it's first of all, it can greatly diminish the inequality of opportunity, even if you do have a large inequality of outcomes right now. So if we ask, what are the channels through which high inequality, which is a feature of American society at large, is transmitted into a society in which children who made the mistake of choosing the wrong parents don't manage to get ahead, one of them is access to higher education. And if you have a high-quality, inexpensive, wide-open public education system, that makes a big difference. And again, I think a lot of people who are defenders of American inequality and point to social mobility and then tell their own life stories, a surprising number of them actually went up through inexpensive public sector universities that no longer exist in much of the country. State schools have become far more expensive, far less accessible to ambitious children of poor families than they used to be. So CUNY can play that role, and it does. I mean, all indications are that it is a major engine of upward mobility. I think probably, especially though by no means only, for children of immigrants in a city that is once again, to an important extent, an immigrant city, and that's something that has to be a positive in every dimension. And it's not going to, in the end, if we're asking what will that diminish inequality a lot heading forwards, the answer is probably not, because inequality is not mostly about the educated versus the uneducated. It's mostly about the inequality within education groups, and especially certainly the right tail is out there. So having more people have access to higher education is probably not going to make too much of a difference there, but it will at least mean that the society becomes fairer in terms of who has access to the good jobs, and more productive as well, by the way. I mean, one thing about the kind of inequality we have right now, one reason why, at some sense, although you don't really see, I don't think you see solid evidence for inequality hurting growth, but surely there's a huge waste of human potential that we have right now with many bright young people who could be making a big contribution to society never having that chance. And something like the CUNY system can at least make a dent in all of that.
And what is your thought about this issue with student debt? We hear so much about that, of course, with Senator Warren.
Well, student debt is there are multiple. It's bad on multiple levels. One is that it is a large burden that is, and it not helpful even in terms of macroeconomic management. We do not need another form of household debt dragging us down. And then a lot of it is incurred in the for-profit education system sector, which is a horror. It's something like the 21st century equivalent of the meatpacking industry when Sinclair Lewis was writing it. This is there's a lot of fraud, a lot of people who are running themselves into debt for credentials that aren't actually worth anything. And the contrast with a public system that is a little bit of a chewing gum and Scotch tape enterprise, because the funding has never been lavish, but delivers a genuine education and does so by and large without requiring that students go deep into debt. That's a hopeful and inspiring story, and we could use more of it.
Well, on that note, let me do what we've promised, which is to turn the rest of our session over to question and answer. There are microphones, I think, on both sides, and I'm going to say the requisite. Please tell us who you are, and if you give a speech, limit it to 10 seconds.
And talk loud.
And talk loud for our gentleman friend here. If not, we'll yell the question in his ear.
Yeah.
I can sort of say, let me ask you to go first.
Hi, Roger Blissett again. Professor Krugman, absent from the conversation about predistribution was the impact of technology and how technology can be can impact mobility with regards to employers shifting or replacing workers. I was in a rush this morning and went into McDonald's, and I was greeted by kiosks that I could queue in my order. I'm just wondering, if we raise minimum wages, will technology be a threat to the replacement of workers? Just so you could talk about technology in terms of this issue of predistribution.
Okay. So this is a raging debate. Technology, how much of... So we have seen a shift we have seen since 2000 or so, a change in the story. Before 2000, rising inequality was largely inequality in earnings. Since 2000, there's also been a return to the old labor versus capital division, with the share of all forms of compensation and income declining. One story about that is that it's about technology. There are some problems with that as a story. One problem is that if we were seeing an explosion of technological progress that replaced workers, you would expect to see productivity growing rapidly. And in fact, productivity growth seems to be stalling. So we don't actually, if the robots are making it unnecessary to hire the workers, why don't we seem to be getting more output per worker of those who remain? The other is if robots can do such great stuff, we should expect businesses to see a high rate of return on investment and therefore to be investing a lot. And in fact, business investment has been kind of weak. So I'm not sure it's not at all clear, put it this way, that the technological changes that we're seeing are any more rapid than they were in the past, or that they are really replacing a lot of workers. It might be true in the future. There's no guarantee. But right now it does not look, it looks as if that's probably not the main story. It's very easy to hype technology, and as it happens, the technologies that the technological changes we've been experiencing are ones that those of us in the chattering classes see a lot of. So we see, that everything's available on the internet and it's all super fast. But if in terms of, is any of that comparable to farm machinery replacing agricultural workers, or for that matter, mass assembly line production replacing craftsmen, which were arguably much bigger changes in the past? You can argue that we hype our technological changes, but that they're actually disappointing. It's the yellow line. We were promised flying cars, and instead we got 140 characters. And so it's not clear. And by the way, always an excuse. If you go back to the 30s, you'll find lots of people saying, "Oh, it's not really. There's nothing we can do with policy. This is all because of modern technology means that our workforce no longer has the skills required to operate." And then all of a sudden, we got a large fiscal stimulus, otherwise known as World War II, and it turned out that actually we did need those workers after all.
My name is John Torpy. I'm director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies here at the Graduate Center. My heart sank as the previous questioner asked his question, because mine revolved around some of the same issues. But Janet has kind of spoken to this a little bit, and some of your answer just addressed it a little bit. But I guess I'm sort of thinking about the transformation in kinds of employment relationships. So if we think of the middle of the 20th century as the glorious 30 years and mass production economies and the kinds of middle-class jobs that came out of that didn't have to be middle class because of unions and that sort of thing, that many people are now talking about a new kind of economy, the gig economy. And I wonder how, in which people aren't employees at all, and what kind of impact that's having, not just on their incomes, but also on their lives as a whole. So I wonder if you could comment on how important you think that's going to be, how much of a transformation that's going to take.
Yeah. The short answer is, of course, I don't know. And people who are trying to study it are finding that it's a lot harder to find the gig economy in the data than in the newspaper stories, which is partly reflecting the data, but partly also reflecting the fact that it's not nearly as big as you might think from the exposure. So there are everybody knows about Uber, but if you think that that's an exemplar of a wide class of stuff, that's a possible future, but not actually happening yet. And then there's always the question on these things: how much of what you see is really that technology is creating a revolution, and how much of it is just essentially regulatory evasion. So if what you're seeing is that technology gives people clever new ways to evade worker protections, and then the answer is not to be fatalistic, but possibly to say, hey, we need to expand the regulations. So think about finance. I mean, explosion of new forms of finance over the 20 years before 2008, and a lot of people were saying this represents fundamental change, progress. We now realize that a lot of it was simply a way of evading the prudential regulations that had been imposed on commercial banks by having things that created all the same risks without the oversight. And now we know we have made at least a partial stab at extending the controls to the new sector. It turns out, hey, repo is not that much better than deposits and after all. So I think it's an open question, but it's way too... we have lots of reason to believe that there's still lots of room to improve working conditions through legislation, through the idea that everything will dissolve into a world of free agents negotiating one-on-one over the web is probably a long, long ways off and may never happen.
I'm Jack Hammond in sociology at CUNY, and my question is about pre-distribution measures that might affect top incomes. You suggested that you don't think a maximum income rule is feasible, but that you talked about the changes in corporate boards composition that might be effective in that area. I wonder if there aren't other measures that you could think of with regard to financial regulation, corporate organization, or similar sorts of things that would make it at least more difficult for corporations to pay the salaries that they are paying to their highest executives, and the dividends, of course, and stock options and so forth.
Yeah, the answer is I wish I were more of an expert. I'm sure that there are. I would think that in particular there have to be ways to make it more transparent. That I think by and large it's quite unclear just how much top executives are being paid, and not just CEOs. We really want to be talking about a kind of inner circle, but I should know more than I do.
Well, Dodd-Frank introduced new requirements, right, for the public. I don't know if anyone has discerned yet whether that seems to be having any effect or not, but I think there is. Just to come back, Paul, you talked earlier, I've heard you say this before, but about this sort of the decaying of the outrage factor.
That's right.
So I guess that's another question, is do you have any sense, it's not really an economic question, I suppose it's a sociological question, how to reintroduce the outrage factor other than through structural change like increasing union representation?
Yeah, my guess is that if we actually did see a resurgence of organized labor, that you would find that there would be a kind of cumulative effect, that as there were more stronger players, that the critique of self-serving behavior at the top would become more mainstream again. Just that we think that there was a kind of a cumulative process in the other direction that led to us getting to where we are now. And nobody knows this really, but it seems, my guess is that if you look at any one thing that you might do, whether it's corporate boards, unions, it's going to look like, well, that can't matter very much, but that the sum could be quite a lot larger than the whole of the parts when it comes to these kinds of measures.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Bekha Pham. I was wondering about worker cooperative businesses. Here in the city council and the mayor's office has put forward some funds to help start some new worker cooperative businesses. Some of those organizations are trying to, I guess, increase the volume or mass of the cooperatives by looking at larger contracts, like let's say the bus drivers in the city, and once and converting those businesses to worker cooperatives so that you have a little bit more of a scale and impact. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Okay, I only got part of that.
Worker cooperatives, is that the growth of worker-owned businesses and so forth, is that a viable and powerful tool for...
Good question, and the answer is I don't know. I've done no homework on that whatsoever. Sorry, I wish I did. I mean, it sounds good, but I have no idea.
It's a good question.
Hi, Jim Parsons from the Vera Institute of Justice. With the huge increase in the number of people who are becoming involved in the criminal justice system over the last 20 or 30 years, the increase in the number of people who've become involved in the criminal justice system over the last 20 or 30 years, and the extent to which that limits their ability to engage in a formal economy, I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about how that's affecting equality in a place like New York City, and some of the steps that could be taken to reduce the impact that justice system involvement will have on both individuals and the city as a whole.
All right, this is a field on which I have learned nothing. I mean, I've never touched it at all. I only know what any halfway interested reader of the newspapers knows. So it just that it's a huge number, but I have no idea what role that plays in shifting the overall picture. Sorry.
It's interesting, if I can jump in, to say that this discussion is enormous, and it has been quite disconnected from inequality research. I think there is extraordinary body of research showing that incarceration destroys people's future work trajectories, especially African American men. Enormous numbers of people are essentially out of the labor force, the formal labor force, forever. So we have heard about policy interventions, for example, in fact, that would disallow employers at the hiring stage, to ask, to allow people to mask some of that information. But I think that a lot of these issues have been indeed very divorced from this discussion about inequality. That would be my little intervention there. I think there's another question here.
Yeah.
Sure. So I actually want you to comment a little bit on Professor Milanovic's work, which you touched on a little bit earlier, and the idea of there's the peak in the global middle, which is at about $10 per day, and I think still well over a fifth of the world population that makes less than $1 a day. And I want you to put that in somewhat the context of what we're talking about in New York City, which is a city of immigrants. So how can we think about that global distribution on a metropolitan scale? Especially for me, what stands out from his work is that someone who makes $12 an hour is in the 85th percentile globally for income. So what can we think of that in New York City?
I think the implication might be, if we were to take the current population of New York City and ask how have the individuals who are in New York City, how does their income compare with their own income 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or the income of their parents, there would be a significant group of people who are relatively low down in the distribution here, but for whom it's an enormous gain. So we shouldn't, it's one, if you like, one positive thing to set against the inequalities that are actually existing in the city at a point in time, to say, well, we have immigrants for whom this has been a tremendous uplift, even if they're in the lower half of the distribution now. I'm not sure exactly what bearing that has on the policies we should pursue, however. I mean, it's a little bit like if you had said if you looked at New York City in 1929, it would have been a highly unequal city, many of whose residents had nonetheless achieved an enormous improvement in their lives by getting out of southern Italy or Eastern Europe to move there. That didn't mean that the coming of the New Deal, which actually, in many ways came to New York before it came to the rest of the country, was unnecessary or a bad thing. So I think you can let those two observations coexist. I'm not sure. I think that the Milanovic picture I find extremely useful as a corrective to people who have a romantic view of the pre-globalization economy. That you want to say, look, this is not, there's a lot of people for whom, for all its faults, the things that have happened in the world economy these past 30 years is a very, very good thing. But that not to, I'm not sure that it has that, certainly the observation that New York is a city where some people have immigrated and that's been a very good thing for them, changes the fact that we should be doing what we can to mitigate the inequality that we have now.
Can I just add to, I'm going to add to that, take the questioner's prerogative here. The graph that we're referring to, I've often noted this, that it's a little odd to talk about a graph that most of you probably haven't seen.
It looks like that.
Yeah, it looks like this. It's a cool graph that we all like. But what it shows is the story that it's being told is really essentially about the rise of India and China. And as globalization has taken place and history has unfolded, obviously there's an enormous number of people in the global income distribution who have become better off. But indeed, at the real income levels that are shocking to American ears, that's another Milanovic picture also, was that the bottom 10 in the United States is at the real income level of the top 90 and many other places. But Paul, where this does come back to something that I know you do know about, I see my colleagues are trying to ask you questions on things you don't know about, but this is one you definitely have talked about a lot. Another part of the argument is this argument about the age of oversupply, that as we've had this growing number of workers, several billion workers, many hundreds of millions of workers flooding into the labor market. Do you think that story of globalization and the increase in cheap labor from other countries is part of the rising wage inequality in the United States? How powerful a factor is that?
It is a part of the story, but almost certainly not the majority. So there are a couple of ways you can do that. You can reach that conclusion. One of them is to the more formal, numerical analysis. But I think the right way to say it is, who are the low-wage workers in America today? And at this point, very few of them are in tradable sectors. Very few of them are in sectors that are competing with imports. In part, that's because those sectors went away already. So we no longer have. There was certainly the shrinkage of the apparel industry in the face of import competition reduced the demand for less educated workers in the United States and widened wage inequality. It has to have, other things equal, made wage inequality larger than it would otherwise have been. But that happened a long time ago at this point. We're now talking about something that is quite a ways back. And at this point, we're no longer talking about where imports are really not competing with a significant lower education, lower formal skill level sector anymore. So and yet inequality has continued to rise. That is telling you that there are other factors that are driving it. And, now, until 10 years ago, the orthodoxy was that it was all about technology. But I think we've actually, that hypothesis has largely fallen apart as well. So, in fact, this discussion among serious inequality scholars has shifted increasingly to institutions and policies rather than, so it's not actually the invisible hand of the global economy doing this. It's actually the somewhat visible hand of union breaking and just in general a change in the way we run our society.
And that the evidence for that would be big differences in levels of inequality across relatively similar countries?
Yes, right. I mean, Germany is not any less open to, or Sweden, any less open to imports from the third world than we are.
I think let's take two last questions. One over here.
Okay, hi. I'm Kristen Miller, and I'm Director of Corporation for Supportive Housing in New York City. So we're going to see if you know about housing. When the folks were pulling our equity indicators together, there was a stakeholder process, and the largest concern of the stakeholders was housing.
Yeah.
The federal government has gotten out of the business, practically, of subsidizing housing. And with sequestration, everything that's been going on, how can New York City work to raise the equity for housing in New York?
Okay, not an expert, really, but the little bit of conversation I've had with the mayor's office on this was enough to convince me that is an area where, in fact, local control can make a big difference. Partly, there are a lot of ways in which local policy can affect the supply of housing, can leverage the process of approvals to produce more affordable housing. Yeah, I mean that's one thing that you really can do. And but I am not a housing policy expert at all. So just to say that sounds like something you can say, and obviously, everybody's anecdotal evidence is that there are a lot of good things about this city, but housing affordability is definitely not one of them. And you wonder how anybody who doesn't actually, have either have been lucky enough to get in before or have help from the bank of mom and dad or aunt and uncle manages in this place.
The last question here.
Hi, Roberto Soto with the Committee for Hispanic Children and Families. And I want to ask about the kind of relationship between economic inequality and racism. And I think one of the things we've seen, particularly with the Bernie Sanders campaign, is that we have certain candidates who are really trying to push for kind of an acknowledgement of economic inequality. And some of their critiques have been that this acknowledgement or examination isn't accounting for kind of the ways in which economic inequality really is still racialized in this country. And you've seen some kind of pushback even within groups of supporters kind of saying, well, we need to look at economic inequality, but we also need to look at racism. Or, no, we don't need to talk about race. We need to talk about class. And so I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about kind of your take on some of that debate and what you think needs to happen for us to move towards more of an intersectional analysis and more of a focused examination of race and structural racism when we talk about economic inequality in this country.
Wow. So, in the next hour, no, I mean, again, it's a wimp out thing, but of course both matter. There's plenty of structural racism still out there, arguably less than there was, which is not saying that it's excusable what still exists, but and then there's, but then but class is a bigger issue than ever, and income inequality within races is greater than ever. I'm not sure. I guess at some level there has to be some choices of priorities, but I'm not sure why. I don't think it's a very acute choice. I think it's all very real. And if we had a more equal distribution of earnings, that would probably significantly mitigate some of the racial inequalities as well. Because but I don't really have a very focused answer here. I think it is important to have an understanding. To anyone who, if you are kind of aggressively colorblind here, you're not doing anybody a favor, because that's a long way from being the reality of our society.
I'm going to bring us to a close. Unfortunately, we have to, because then there are other sessions here. So, Paul, one thing I've always appreciated about your work, and many people have, is your rather uncanny ability at times to read the future. So I want to know who is going to be the next president of the United States.
Oh, good God.
And I want to know who the candidates are going to be in both parties. And also, my final question, there was a big movement on the internet last week, I think you were out of the country, calling for you to be the next chair of the Fed. So I want to know if that's going to happen at some point in the future also.
On that one, it's very easy. Take a look at my office already, and you really don't want me running anything. If I could offer a tour right now, I've only been here a limited amount of time. It's already starting to look like a grenade went off. Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything, right? I mean, the prediction markets still, the last I looked, Donald Trump 17%, I think Marco Rubio 38%, Jeb Bush 36%. And so my guess is it's going to be in the end Marco Rubio.
The president or the candidate?
Candidate. and then it's probably going to be Hillary Clinton, and in the end she is probably going to win. But it's but who knows? I mean, all the people who make knowledgeable pronouncements about this never saw Trump coming. They were all the ones who were telling us about the deep bench of highly qualified Republican candidates. So, anything at all can happen. I was just, last night I was talking to an Italian friend who was saying, well, we never thought that Berlusconi could ever actually end up running Italy, so anything can happen.
On that note, anything could happen.
Thank you.